When you think about the pressures of work these days, I mean, the workload, always being connected, job market uncertainty, it's no wonder so many people are struggling with burnout.
Right, right. And that's exactly what drew me to this fascinating research by Dr. Elena Swistunova. It really feels like she's hit the nail on the head with this dissertation.
Oh, totally. I mean, just looking at the keywords, professional burnout, workload, digitalization, labor market instability, technology development, they're all so relevant right now.
Absolutely. It's almost like she had a crystal ball, anticipating the challenges so many of us are facing in the workplace today.
Yeah. So what we're going to do today is kind of take a deep dive into her work, try to understand why it's so important and, how it can potentially help organizations and individuals deal with this burnout epidemic, really, because it's not just a feeling, right? It has real consequences for companies, for productivity, for people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just, feeling a bit tired at the end of the day. It impacts everything from a company's bottom line to an individual's personal relationships, their health, their well-being. It's a huge issue.
And it feels like it's becoming more and more common. Like
Yeah.
everywhere you turn, people are talking about burnout.
Exactly. And part of what makes Dr. Svistunova's work so compelling is that she recognizes that. She acknowledges that burnout is a growing problem across all sectors, not just in, traditionally high-stress fields.
Yeah, and she's not just describing the problem. She's really trying to get at the underlying mechanisms. Like she's exploring the connection between our brains, our neurocognitive processes, and the culture of our workplaces.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that really sets her research apart. She's delving into this relatively unexplored territory of how burnout affects our brain function and how the organizational environment plays a role.
So it's like a two-way street. Burnout affects our brains, but the workplace culture can also make us more or less susceptible to it.
Precisely. And by understanding these connections, we can potentially develop better ways to diagnose burnout, identify people who might be at risk, and create work environments that are more supportive and less likely to contribute to burnout.
Okay, that's a great overview of why Dr. Svistunova's work is so timely and so important. But let's get into the specifics. How does she actually define professional burnout in her dissertation? Like, what are the hallmarks of this state?
Well, she defines it as essentially a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion. And it's important to emphasize that it's not just, being tired after a long day. It's a chronic state of depletion.
Ah, so it's like this ongoing, persistent exhaustion. It's
Mhm.
not something you just shake off after a good night's sleep.
Right, and it stems from prolonged exposure to stressors in the workplace. So it's not just one bad day, it's this accumulation of stress over time.
Makes sense. And I know she talks about three main dimensions of burnout. Can you walk us through those?
Absolutely. So the first one is emotional exhaustion. That feeling of being completely drained, emotionally overextended, like you just have nothing left to give.
Yeah, I think we've all felt that at some point.
The second dimension is depersonalization. And this involves developing a negative, detached, and sometimes even cynical attitude towards your work and the people you work with. It's like a loss of empathy and engagement.
So you start to feel disconnected from your work and the people around you.
Exactly. And the third dimension is reduced personal accomplishment. It's that feeling of ineffectiveness, a lack of a sense of achievement in your work. You feel like you're not making a difference, you're not as competent as you used to be.
So it's this combination of feeling depleted, negative, and ineffective.
Yes, exactly. And what's really interesting is that Dr. Svistunova's research goes beyond these emotional and attitudinal aspects of burnout. She delves into the cognitive effects as well.
Ah, so how burnout affects our thinking.
Exactly. And her research highlights a few key areas. One of them is impaired attention. People struggling with burnout often have difficulty concentrating. They're easily distracted, have trouble focusing.
Yeah, and I can see how that would make work even more challenging.
Right. And her dissertation suggests that this could be related to stress-induced changes in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functions, things like planning, decision-making, and attention control.
Wow, so chronic stress is actually affecting how our brains function.
Yes. And another cognitive area she looked at is working memory. This is our ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it. Like, for example, when you're trying to remember a phone number while you dial it.
Right, or when you're trying to keep track of multiple tasks at once.
Exactly. And stress can negatively impact working memory, making it harder to juggle information and stay organized.
So burnout is basically making it harder to think clearly and efficiently.
And there's also evidence suggesting that long-term memory can be affected as well. Prolonged stress And the elevated levels of stress hormones that come with it can actually be harmful to the hippocampus, which is a key brain area involved in forming new memories.
So it's not just forgetting things in the moment, it's potentially impacting your ability to form new memories altogether.
That's right. And chronic stress can even hinder neurogenesis, which is the formation of new brain cells in the hippocampus. So it's not just about the existing brain cells, it's about the brain's ability to regenerate and adapt.
That's pretty concerning.
Hmm.
And then there's that last cognitive aspect you mentioned, rigidity of thinking.
Yes, this refers to a decreased ability to think flexibly, to adapt to new situations, to see things from different perspectives. People with burnout often get stuck in their ways. They have trouble thinking outside the box.
Like their mental agility takes a hit.
Exactly. And again, this is likely related to the impact of chronic stress on the prefrontal cortex, which is crucial for cognitive flexibility.
Wow, so we're seeing how burnout affects us on so many levels. Emotionally, mentally, even physically.
Absolutely. It's this interconnected web of effects, and it highlights why it's so important to address burnout proactively.
Now, one of the things that really stood out to me in Dr. Svistunova's dissertation is her focus on organizational culture. Why is that so important in the context of burnout?
Well, organizational culture, which is essentially the shared values, beliefs, and norms that shape how people interact and work within a company, has a profound impact on employee well-being. It influences everything from their motivation and job satisfaction to their emotional stability and sense of belonging.
Where it's like the personality of a company, the vibe you get when you walk in the door.
Exactly. And Dr. Swistунова talks about 3 different levels of organizational culture: observable artifacts, espoused values, and basic underlying assumptions.
Okay, let's break those down. What are those 3 levels all about?
So, the first level, observable artifacts, refers to the things you can see and experience in a company, like the physical layout of the office, the dress code, the way people communicate, the rituals and traditions they have.
Yeah, the stuff that's kind of on the surface, the visible elements.
Right. And then the second level is espoused values.
Yeah.
These are the principles and goals that the company explicitly states and promotes. You know, things like innovation, customer focus, teamwork, that kind of thing.
So what they say they believe in.
Exactly. But then the third level, basic underlying assumptions, is where it gets really interesting. These are the unconscious, deeply ingrained beliefs and perceptions that really drive behavior in a company. And they're often unspoken, taken for granted.
So like the unwritten rules, the things people just know intuitively.
Right. It's the culture that's kind of operating beneath the surface, influencing how people make decisions and interact.
So it sounds like a strong, positive organizational culture,
Yeah.
especially at that deeper level of assumptions, can actually be protective against burnout. Is that right?
Absolutely. When people feel like they belong, like they're part of a supportive community, they tend to be more resilient to stress. And a healthy organizational culture can foster that sense of connection and belonging.
Yeah, it's that feeling of we're all in this together. It can make a huge difference when you're facing challenges.
And a strong culture can also shape positive behavior patterns like clear communication, constructive conflict resolution, openness to new ideas. These things can create a more psychologically safe and supportive environment.
So it's not just about feeling good. It's about having structures and processes that help people navigate challenges effectively.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that there's this emerging field called organizational neuroscience, which suggests that workplace culture can actually affect our brain function on a biological level.
So the culture we're in can literally shape how our brains are reacting. That's pretty powerful.
It is. For example, a culture that's very competitive and high pressure might lead to increased activity in the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that processes fear and stress. So you're essentially wiring people's brains to be in a more stressed state.
Whereas a more supportive, collaborative environment might actually calm those stress responses.
Right. And Dr. Swistунова talks about the potential of incorporating mindfulness practices into organizational culture. Things like meditation, mindful breathing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the benefits of mindfulness for stress reduction. But how would you actually implement that at an organizational level?
It could involve things like offering workshops on mindfulness techniques, encouraging employees to practice during the workday, providing resources like guided meditations, even just creating space for quiet reflection. There are evidence-based programs like mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, that have been successfully implemented in workplaces.
So it's not just about individuals practicing mindfulness on their own. It's about weaving it into the fabric of the company culture.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from Dr. Svistunova's work. We need to think about burnout interventions at both the individual and the organizational level.
Now, in her dissertation, Dr. Svistunova touches on different types of organizational cultures. Are there certain types that might be more or less conducive to burnout?
Well, the excerpt doesn't go into a ton of detail about specific types, but we can make some connections based on what we know. For example, a culture that's highly hierarchical, where there's a lot of top-down control and not much autonomy for employees, might increase stress.
Yeah, that makes sense. Feeling like you have no control of your work can be incredibly stressful.
On the other hand, a culture that's very competitive, where everyone's constantly striving to outperform each other, might also lead to burnout. It creates a sense of pressure and anxiety that can be difficult to sustain.
So different cultural values and structures can create different kinds of stressors.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of organizational norms, which are the unwritten rules about how things are done in a company. These norms can have a huge impact on burnout as well.
So like the unspoken expectations around workload, communication style, taking breaks, that kind of thing.
Right. For example, a norm of constantly being available, always checking emails, never truly disconnecting, can contribute to burnout. It creates this sense of always being on, of never being able to fully relax and recharge.
And how do these norms develop? It's not like they're written down anywhere.
They emerge through social interactions, through the behavior of leaders and colleagues, through the rewards and sanctions that are in place. Like, if someone gets praised for working late every night, that sends a message about what's expected and valued.
So it's this subtle but powerful force that shapes how people behave.
Exactly. And from a neurocognitive perspective, these norms can activate different brain regions. Like, norms around constant availability might trigger the stress response, while norms that encourage collaboration and support could activate reward pathways related to social connection.
So the norms we create can literally shape how our brains are responding to the work environment.
Right. And that brings us back to Dr. Svistunova's research. Based on what we know about her findings, what are some specific examples of how different organizational cultures might relate to neurocognitive functions?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what she discovered.
Well, one thing she found is that a market culture, which is often characterized by competitiveness and a focus on results, seems to be linked to higher levels of emotional exhaustion. And this effect was particularly pronounced for individuals who had lower scores on attention tests.
So a high-pressure, results-driven environment might be especially draining for people who already struggle with focus.
Exactly. And she also found that employees in a market culture reported feeling a lot of pressure, which they said negatively impacted their memory and concentration.
So their subjective experience aligns with the quantitative findings.
Right. And on the other hand, she found that a clan culture, which emphasizes teamwork and employee well-being, seemed to reduce emotional exhaustion.
Makes sense. A supportive environment can buffer against stress.
And this protective effect of a clan culture was especially strong for people who had good memory and attention skills. So it seems like having strong cognitive resources can help you thrive even in a demanding environment, but a supportive culture can really make a difference, especially if you're already feeling strained.
Yeah, it highlights the importance of creating work environments that support employees' cognitive and emotional well-being. Now, given Dr. Svistunova's expertise in both the neurocognitive and organizational aspects of burnout, what kind of practical guidance can she offer to companies? Like, what are some specific interventions that organizations could implement based on her research?
Her research really paves the way for more targeted and effective well-being programs. At the individual level, she might recommend things like cognitive training to improve attention, memory, and executive function.
So it's like giving employees mental fitness training.
Exactly. And these programs can be tailored to an individual's needs based on a neuropsychological assessment. She might also recommend neurofeedback, where people learn to regulate their own brain activity through real-time feedback. This has shown promise in reducing stress and anxiety.
So it's like giving people more control over their own stress responses.
Right. And of course, mindfulness and meditation practices can be very helpful. But it's not just about individual level interventions. Dr. Svistunova also emphasizes the importance of organizational level changes.
So what kind of changes would she recommend at that level?
Well, she might work with a company to transform its organizational culture. This could involve assessing the current culture, defining the desired culture, training leaders to embody the new values, involving employees in the change process, and consistently communicating about the culture shift.
So it's about creating a culture that's truly supportive of employee well-being.
Exactly. And she might also help companies implement specific well-being programs. This could include things like stress management workshops, resilience training, access to mental health resources, and policies that promote work-life balance.
So it's a multi-pronged approach that addresses both individual and organizational factors.
Right. And what's key is that Dr. Svistanova's approach is data-driven. She would likely use a variety of assessments to get a clear picture of the specific stressors and challenges within an organization.
So she's not just coming in with prepackaged solutions. She's really tailoring her interventions to the specific needs of the company.
Exactly. She might use neuropsychological tests to assess cognitive function. She might analyze biochemical markers like cortisol levels to get a sense of physiological stress. And she might use organizational culture surveys to understand the prevailing norms and values.
Wow, so she's taking a really comprehensive approach.
She is, and that allows her to develop targeted recommendations that are more likely to be effective.
So for a company that's struggling with burnout, why should they consider consulting with Dr. Svistunova specifically? What makes her expertise so valuable?
Well, first of all, burnout is incredibly costly for companies. It leads to reduced productivity, increased absenteeism, higher turnover rates, and decreased morale. And traditional approaches to addressing burnout often haven't been very effective.
Yeah, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper problem.
Exactly. But Dr. Svistunova offers a different approach. She's bringing a scientific lens to the problem, using data and evidence to develop targeted interventions. And she's not just focusing on individual symptoms, she's looking at the systemic factors that contribute to burnout, including organizational culture.
So she's helping companies address the root causes of burnout,
Yeah.
not just the surface-level symptoms.
Right. And ultimately, her goal is to help companies create work environments that are healthier, more sustainable, and more supportive of employee well-being.
And that's good for everyone. Employees are happier and more productive, and the company benefits from a more engaged and resilient workforce. Now, have there been any general observations or feedback from companies that have implemented well-being programs? Like, what kind of results have they seen?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of research on this, and the findings are pretty consistent. Companies that invest in well-being programs tend to see a lot of positive outcomes.
Like, what kind of outcomes?
Well, they often see improvements in employee productivity, reductions in absenteeism and presenteeism, lower healthcare costs, and increased employee engagement and satisfaction. And they often see a decrease in stress levels and burnout rates.
So it's a win-win. It's good for the employees, and it's good for the company's bottom line.
Right. And it's not just about implementing any program. It's about implementing programs that are well-designed, evidence-based, and tailored to the specific needs of the organization and its employees.
So it's about being strategic and thoughtful in your approach to well-being.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Dr. Svistunova's research and the critical issue of professional burnout. To wrap things up, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that burnout is a complex problem with both individual and organizational roots. And Dr. Svistunova's research shows us that we can't just treat the symptoms. We need to address the underlying causes.
And that involves taking a comprehensive approach that considers both the individual and the organizational level.
Exactly. We need to think about how we can support individuals to build resilience and manage stress. But we also need to think about how we can create work environments that are more supportive, less demanding, and more conducive to well-being.
And that's a challenge for all of us. Leaders, managers, employees, we all have a role to play in creating healthier workplaces.
We do, and I think Dr. Svistanova's work gives us a roadmap for how to do that more effectively.
So for you, the listener, I would encourage you to think about the state of your own workplace. Are there things you could do individually or collectively to create a more supportive and less stressful environment? Because ultimately, we all deserve to work in places that value our well-being and help us thrive. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.